In 1985, the Disney film Return to Oz was released in cinemas, and a few years later made its way onto home VHS. I can't remember how old I was at the time I seen it, perhaps 5 years old at most. I knew right away that there was something unusual about the film, something especially disturbing. I remember that the first time I seen it, I cried. I remember watching the film, glued in place in front of the television, not out of involvement, but out of terror. Truth be told, it is a bloody scary film. Now, before you groan and go listen to something else, don't worry, this isn't a story about a haunted videotape. The film itself played out perfectly normal, as much as possible. Dorothy didn't turn to the camera and start screaming while blood poured out of her eyes or anything stupid like that. I just want to tell you how I felt when I watched this video, and some of the strange things it reminded me about. It's a strange story. I really wonder quite what the producer, Paul Mazansky, was thinking at the time. I know that the power behind the film didn't really rest with him. Instead, it rested with the film's director, Walter Murch, a specialist in sound and editing. Murch worked on editing for films like The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, but Return to Oz was his only venture into directing. I keep thinking that something may have happened to him during the production of this film, maybe something that put him off directing any films from then onwards, but that's just a guess. My mother got a copy of the film on VHS. I remember distinctly because she also had a copy of the old Judy Garland musical version. She loved that film. I was somewhat less impressed with it. The sepia opening for a child who was used to colour television seemed boring to me. I didn't care for the dancing and the witch didn't impress me. All the sets looked just too false, and I found myself not appreciating the film. My mother, though, loved it. When I was an adult, she told me about the Judy Garland's drug addiction and her gradual fall from Hollywood grace, a story that felt equally tragic to anything on the silver screen. Return to Oz, however, wasn't a sequel. In fact, the only thing that connected it to the musical version was the presence of ruby slippers, which were silver in the original book. But my mother was still excited to see it, so she asked a friend to find her a copy of the film and we'd watched it. The film tells the story of Dorothy's return to the wonderful land of Oz. Or at least, it should be wonderful, but it really isn't. But she's desperate to go back, and when we first meet her in the film, she's very depressed, miserable and lonely. The very first image we have in the film is her staring, sadly, into a dirty mirror. And before long, her family take her to a hospital. At the hospital, which it transpires is more of an asylum, Dorothy is introduced to a doctor, keen to try out the newly invented electrical healing machine. The doctor introduces Dorothy to it, pointing out the machine's features like, here, he explains, pointing to the voltage meter, is its mouth, and here, he explains, pointing to the switch that will send crackling shocks of electricity searing through the young girl's skull, is the nose. She's escorted down into the bowels of the hospital, through tall and towering hallways, and locked within a barren, empty cell. That night, she's strapped to a hospital bed and, whilst the screams of the other inmates echo through the hospital, is secured to the electric machine. A storm rages outside, and soon it knocks out the hospital's power, during which Dorothy's rescued by another girl. Together, they flee into the river at the banks of the hospital where they drown. Dorothy returns to the land of Oz. She journeys there in the ruins of an old crate floating down the river. That's the way the story goes, but that's not all that happens. In the old Wizard of Oz film, the one with Judy Garland, Dorothy's house is plucked out of the farm by a hurricane. We all know that hurricanes don't move people from one location and drop them gently and carefully down in another. If she had been a real person, caught in a small wooden farmhouse in the winds of a hurricane, Dorothy would have died. And maybe she did, and all the rest of the film was simply a hallucination within her fevered and frantic brain. No, that's just a theory. In this film, in Return to Oz, Dorothy falls into the churning waters of the river, struggling to stay above its surface, her arms splashing, her mouth gasping for air, and then she's in Oz. And for a few moments, everything seems fine. Everything seems quite happy. She finds a talking chicken called Billina, who offers to travel with her on the way to the Emerald City. Along the way, she finds a tree which distributes lunchboxes filled with ready-made sandwiches. It's almost like everything may turn out alright once they get to Emerald City, because then she'll be able to get back to her farm. Her farm, where she sat staring into the dirty mirror, her eyes heavy with despair. David Kerr of the Chicago Reader described this film as bleak, creepy, and occasionally terrifying. You don't want Dorothy to go home, not to the world full of doctors who want to rip the happiness from her, from the nurses who tie her down, from the towering hallways and electric machines with wide, grinning mouths.